Rain slid down the glass like silver threads, tracing the skyline of Seattle 40 floors below. The city pulsed with light and life, but inside the penthouse, everything was still. The hum of the dishwasher echoed from the kitchen, steady, lonely, almost human. Richard stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring at nothing. Behind him, Evelyn stacked plates, the scent of lemon soap clinging to her skin. They lived surrounded by marble and glass, yet neither had touched the other's heart in months. Have you ever shared a home so quiet it made you forget what laughter sounds like? Outside, sirens wailed faintly, fading into the distance. Evelyn poured herself a glass of water. The sound was louder than their words had been all evening. Once, this room had been filled with jazz music and burnt toast on Sunday mornings. Now, it was filled with polite silence, the kind that hurts more than shouting ever could. She looked at his reflection on the window, distant, untouchable. He looked at the city as if searching for something he'd lost. Maybe it was her, maybe it was himself. He didn't know that one photo, one small moment of sunlight on her face would shatter the walls he'd spent years building. And that's how it began. The story neither of them saw coming. The city glittered below him like 1,000 restless stars, moving and blinking beneath the misty Seattle night. From the 40th floor, Richard could see the harbor lights flicker through the drizzle, the slow crawl of headlights along the bridge, the reflection of the moon caught between glass towers. Behind him, the dishwasher hummed steady, rhythmic, a sound so ordinary it filled the vast penthouse like a heartbeat that belonged to no one. Evelyn stood barefoot in the kitchen, her hair tied loosely, sleeves rolled to her elbows. The scent of dish soap and lemon hung in the air. She stacked the plates carefully, one by one, as if quiet precision might keep the silence from swallowing her whole. "Some homes," she once read, "echo louder when silence falls." Tonight, the echo felt endless. Richard's reflection in the window looked more like a stranger than a husband. The soft glow from the city lit the edge of his face, carving sharp lines where warmth used to live. He wasn't angry, nor unkind, just distant. The kind of distance that grows from neglect, not cruelty. On the counter, Evelyn's phone lit up with a new message. "A friend from years ago. Haven't seen you post anything in forever. Are you okay?" She turned the screen face down. What could she say? That she lived in a house big enough to get lost in, with a man who had already forgotten where she was. The dishwasher clicked, releasing a puff of steam. Richard didn't move. He rarely did after dinner anymore. Work had become his compass, the office, his true home. He had built empires out of numbers and glass, but between these walls, he'd built only silence. "Long day," Evelyn asked softly, her voice almost a whisper. He nodded, still looking out at the skyline. "Board meeting went late. You eat." I grabbed something downtown. It was a familiar exchange, their version of conversation, words that meant nothing, floating between them like dust in the evening air. Evelyn poured herself tea, the kind she used to brew for both of them. Once, he'd said her chamomile made him sleep better. She almost smiled, remembering that. Then let the thought fade. Memories were dangerous here. They made the emptiness sharper. Richard loosened his tie, glanced toward the couch, then back to the window. He didn't notice the new vase on the table, or the framed photo she'd added one from their honeymoon in Vancouver. She had placed it there 2 weeks ago, just to see if he'd notice. He hadn't. From outside, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the bay. Evelyn turned off the lights in the kitchen, leaving only the soft amber glow from a lamp near the couch. The city beyond the glass looked alive, almost breathing. Inside, time stood still. She sat down on the edge of the sofa, folding her hands in her lap. For a moment, she looked at him the way one might study an old photograph, familiar and foreign all at once. His profile hadn't changed, the strong jaw, the calm eyes, but the warmth that used to live there, gone, like a house with the lights turned off. When did we stop talking? She wondered silently. When did I start measuring love by the sound of a dishwasher? Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, typed something quickly, then slipped it back into his pocket. A text from his assistant. Probably. Evelyn knew better than to ask. "Tomorrow I'll be in Tokyo," he said suddenly. "I know. You mentioned it last week. I'll only be gone a few days." She nodded. "Safe flight." The words sounded small. She wanted to say more anything, but her throat tightened instead. She watched him adjust his cufflinks, the silver ones she had given him years ago for his promotion. He didn't even realize he still wore them. "Do you need help packing?" she asked. He shook his head. "I'll do it later." She stood, gathering the empty teacup and walking it to the sink. The floor felt cold under her feet. She rinsed the cup slowly, tracing circles in the porcelain. In the reflection of the window above the sink, she could see him still standing there motionless, as if the city outside mattered more than the life inside. There was a time when he used to turn around, a time when he would walk over, rest a hand on her shoulder, and say something simple like, "You okay?" That time felt like another lifetime. Some people lose love through fights, she thought. We lost ours through silence. She dried her hands, hung the towel neatly, and turned off the kitchen light. The faint hum of the dishwasher had stopped. The penthouse was quiet again. The kind of quiet that presses against your chest. Richard finally turned away from the window. "I'll be gone early," he said. I'll leave the car for you." "Okay." Their voices were polite, like two strangers practicing courtesy in an elevator. He hesitated, maybe to say something more, but the words never came. He only looked at the clock on the wall, checked his phone again, then headed toward the bedroom. Evelyn stayed in the living room a little longer. The city lights reflected in her eyes like tiny fires. She could still hear the soft echo of his footsteps fading down the hall. The penthouse seemed to exhale when he closed the door. She sank onto the sofa, pulling the throw blanket over her knees. The scent of his cologne still lingered faintly in the air, mixed with lemon and rain. She reached for her phone again, thumb hovering over her friend's message. "Are you okay?" Her fingers typed, "Yes, I'm fine." Then she deleted it. Outside, the rain began again, soft, steady, forgiving. She closed her eyes, listening. The sound reminded her of the first night they moved in, when they danced in the living room, laughing as thunder cracked over the city. The same rain, the same view. But back then, the silence had been comfortable, shared. Now it was a wall. The bedroom light clicked off. Footsteps stopped. A pause, heavy with distance. "Good night," Richard said from down the hall, voice calm, almost automatic. Evelyn opened her eyes but didn't look up. "Night," she whispered back. The sound drifted into the dark, swallowed by the hum of the city below. Somewhere, deep inside her, something small and quiet began to shift, like the first tremor before a wave. And though neither of them knew it yet, the silence that had defined their lives was about to be broken. The morning light crept through the tall glass windows, soft and cold, spilling across the marble floor like water. Evelyn blinked awake to an empty bed, the pillow beside her still untouched, the sheets smooth. The faint smell of his cologne lingered, the kind that fades but never fully leaves. She turned her head toward the clock. 6:12. He was already gone. In the kitchen, the coffee maker hummed, steady and low, filling the air with that bitter, familiar scent. She moved slowly, her slippers brushing against the tiles, and set 2 plates on the table out of habit. 2 cups, 2 forks. The second plate stayed untouched. The coffee cooled beside it. A quiet ritual of remembering, outside. The city was waking up, the distant groan of traffic, the whistle of wind between towers, a gull crying somewhere over the bay. But here, in this place of glass and steel, everything stayed still. She took a bite of toast she couldn't taste and looked at the seat across from her. For a moment, she imagined him there, reading the paper like he used to, smiling faintly whenever she said something silly. Then she blinked, and the chair was empty again. She reached for her phone, scrolled through old photos, birthdays, dinners, small moments she once believed would last forever. In one, he was laughing, his arm around her waist, their faces flushed from the wind at Pike Place Market. She remembered how he'd used to send her letters, long ones, written on hotel stationery from his travels. His handwriting had always been a little messy, but every word had warmth. Miss you already. Can't wait to come home. Now. The only messages he sent were short, clipped, professional, landed, busy, talk later. She opened the latest email from him. 3 words. Flight arrived, meetings, no greeting, no closing, just information, nothing more. Evelyn stared at the screen for a long moment before locking it and setting it face down on the table. The sound of the ticking clock filled the space between her breaths. "When did I become a guest in my own life?" she whispered. The words felt strange on her tongue, like something both new and long overdue. The dishwasher clicked behind her, the same hum, the same rhythm as last night. She had come to measure time by appliances the dryer's cycle, the coffee machine's beep, the soft thud of the elevator doors, everything mechanical, predictable, reliable, everything he was not anymore. She finished her toast, washed her cup, and lingered by the sink. Outside, the sky had turned a washed-out gray. A drizzle began, the kind that blurred the world, but didn't quite clean it. She traced a finger along the cool countertop, her reflection faint in the dark glass. A memory surfaced without asking. Their second anniversary. He had surprised her with dinner at a rooftop restaurant, her favorite wine, and a handwritten note folded under the napkin. To my partner, my home. He had called her home. She remembered the way he looked at her then, steady, certain, as if she were something sacred. Now, she couldn't remember the last time he had looked at her at all. The phone buzzed again. She didn't move to check it, probably a delivery confirmation or a marketing email. She reached instead for the vase on the counter, a few white lilies she had bought herself 3 days ago. Their petals were starting to curl at the edges. Still beautiful, just tired. She trimmed the stems, changed the water, arranging them carefully. The simple act gave her something to hold on to. For a brief moment, the apartment felt almost alive again. She imagined him walking through the door, noticing the flowers, smiling, saying you always pick the right kind. But he wouldn't. He never noticed small things anymore, not even her quiet attempts to fill the silence. She set the vase back, stepped away, and laughed softly under her breath. The sound startled her. It had been so long since laughter had come out without effort. It faded quickly, swallowed by the stillness. Her eyes drifted toward the wall calendar near the pantry. She froze. The small red circle she'd drawn weeks ago stared back at her. Today's date. Their wedding anniversary. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She walked closer, tracing the circle with her finger. She had marked it to remind herself, not because she expected celebration, but because she couldn't bear to forget. 10 years. 10 years since she'd walked down that aisle, trembling with joy, believing that love could outlast everything. 10 years. And now she stood here alone, holding a cold cup of coffee. She checked her phone again, almost hoping, no message, no call, no happy anniversary. Evie, not even a calendar reminder shared by his assistant. Nothing. It shouldn't have hurt as much as it did. She had trained herself not to expect anything. But the ache came anyway, quiet, deep, familiar. The kind that didn't shout, the kind that lived in the spaces between ordinary moments. She turned off the kitchen light and stood by the window, watching the rain gather and slide down the glass. The city below blurred into soft streaks of gray and gold. Somewhere out there. Richard was probably sitting in a boardroom, surrounded by people who still listened when he spoke. She wondered if he'd look out his window tonight and think of her. She already knew the answer. Her reflection stared back at her, hair tied, eyes tired, shoulders slightly slumped. She lifted her chin, as if challenging the woman in the glass to deny what she'd become. Invisible? The rain softened to a drizzle, A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. Evelyn pressed her palm against the cold window pane. It's not that he stopped loving me, she thought. It's that he stopped seeing me. She stayed there until her fingers went numb. Then she turned away, gathering her bag and coat, deciding to step outside. Anywhere was better than here. She walked through the lobby, the marble floors echoing beneath her heels. The doorman smiled politely. "Morning, Mrs. Hale." She nodded back. The title sounded heavy now, like a name that belonged to someone else. The air outside was cool, damp, and alive. She inhaled deeply, the scent of wet pavement and coffee drifting from the cafe across the street. For a second, she felt almost free until she remembered why she had nowhere to go. By the time she returned home, the city lights were flickering on, painting the apartment in pale gold. She hung her coat, placed her bag on the chair, and noticed an envelope lying on the counter. His handwriting. Her heartbeat quickened. She tore it open, half hoping. Inside was a note. 3 words. Flight delayed. Tomorrow. No mention of the date. No sign he remembered. She folded the note carefully, set it on the table beside the empty plate that had waited for him all day. Then she sat down, staring at the 2 cups growing cold together. One for him, one for her. But tonight, even the cups looked mismatched. She rested her chin in her hand, eyes stinging, and whispered to the quiet room. "Happy anniversary, Richard." The rain began again outside, soft and steady, as if the sky itself remembered what he had forgotten. And somewhere deep inside her, something fragile cracked not loudly, but enough to let the air in. The morning was pale and quiet, the kind that felt suspended between night and day. Evelyn stood in the bedroom, folding Richard's shirts with the same care she used to reserve for love letters. The open suitcase lay on the bed, half-packed, a neat arrangement of suits, ties, and a small leather toiletry bag. She could still smell his cologne on the collar of a crisp white shirt, a scent that made her chest tighten before she pushed the thought away. The room was too large, too perfect. Light filtered through sheer curtains, catching on the silver frame of their wedding photo. They looked young there, her hand in his smile unguarded. It had been taken on a windy day in June, the kind where everything felt possible. She glanced at it for only a second before turning back to the suitcase. That smile didn't belong to her anymore. In the top drawer of his dresser, she reached for an extra set of cufflinks. Her fingers brushed against something buried beneath a stack of documents, an old envelope. Yellowed at the edges, sealed but slightly torn. Curiosity tugged at her. She hesitated, then pulled it out. Inside were photographs, glossy, warm-toned, printed on the kind of paper people used before everything lived on screens. She recognized his face first. Richard, younger, softer somehow. His arm was around a woman she didn't know. Her laughter caught mid-motion, her eyes bright and alive. They stood by the edge of a lake, sunlight scattering across the water. His expression? God. It was different. His whole body leaned toward her. Open, unguarded. The smile in that photo didn't belong to the man who now lived behind glass and silence. She turned the photo over. A faint smudge of ink on the back Lake Chelan. 2008. L+R. Her breath caught. Laura Benton. The name came to her slowly, like a memory she'd tried to forget. A journalist he once mentioned, an old friend, a brief story from before they met. She'd never asked more, never wanted to. But here she was, holding proof that there had been a life, a version of him she'd never known. She looked at the next photo, him in a dark jacket, leaning against a car. His eyes crinkled with laughter as the woman pressed her forehead against his. It wasn't jealousy that stung her. It was recognition, or rather, the absence of it. That man in the photo, the warmth, the ease she didn't recognize him. The dishwasher hummed faintly from the kitchen below, a reminder that life was still happening somewhere, even if not here. Evelyn sat down on the edge of the bed, the photos trembling slightly in her hands. "I don't even recognize the man I married anymore," she whispered. Her voice barely existed. It was more air than sound. The rain began again outside, soft and steady against the glass. She traced her thumb over his face in the photograph, her reflection rippling faintly in the glossy surface. For a moment, she imagined him laughing like that again, unburdened, human. It hurt in ways she couldn't name. This wasn't about betrayal. It was about loss, the quiet kind that eats away at you, while everything on the outside stays perfectly intact. He had become a man of meetings and mergers, of suits and silence. The man who once scribbled love notes in hotel lobbies had turned into someone who didn't even remember their anniversary. Evelyn gathered the photos, slipped them back into the envelope, and smoothed the edges. She placed it carefully into the drawer where she'd found it, exactly how it had been, as if erasing her own discovery could undo the ache it left behind. She closed the drawer gently. The sound of it sliding shut was final, like the soft click of a door closing for the last time. Her gaze fell on the suitcase again. She folded the last of his shirts, zipped the case halfway, and rested her hand on the handle. The quiet stretched thin around her. She could almost hear his voice in her head, the way he used to say her name soft, deliberate, like a promise. That too had faded, on the nightstand. His watch ticked faintly, the only pulse in the room. She picked it up, checked the time, and set it back. Every detail was perfect: clothes folded, shoes polished, documents organized. She had done everything right, but something inside her had shifted, subtle but irreversible. She walked to the window. The city stretched below, gray and endless. Her reflection hovered in the glass beside the skyline, a woman in her late 30s, beautiful in a quiet, forgotten way. Her wedding ring glinted in the morning light. She twisted it once, then let her hand fall. Evelyn thought about how strange it was, the way love could fade not through anger, but through neglect. How a man could stop looking, and in doing so, make the person beside him disappear. She wondered if Richard still kept these photographs because they reminded him of who he used to be, or because he'd simply forgotten they were there. The sound of an airplane passed faintly overhead, invisible in the clouds. Somewhere out there, his future waited meetings, flights, numbers. She would send him off with a kiss on the cheek and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the same way she always did. She bent down, zipped the suitcase closed, and smoothed her hands over the leather. Her heart felt both heavy and strangely calm. It wasn't anger that filled her. It was the quiet understanding that something precious had already died. Not love exactly, but the hope of it. She straightened the collar of his coat hanging by the door, brushed invisible dust from the shoulders, and adjusted the tie draped over the chair. These small gestures, once filled with care, had become her way of pretending everything was fine. Evelyn walked to the dresser one last time, her fingers lingering on the drawer's smooth surface. Inside lay the forgotten photographs, hidden in the dark. She pressed her palm flat against the wood, as if to seal them there. When Richard came home to pack, he would never know she'd seen them. He would thank her for the neatly folded clothes, kiss her on the forehead, and leave again for some distant city. And she would smile, because pretending was easier than fighting for something already gone. She stepped back, taking in the room, the polished floors, the untouched bed, the suitcase waiting like a silent witness. The air smelled faintly of rain and linen. Everything in its place. Evelyn stood there for a long time, her hand resting on the suitcase handle, her eyes fixed on the window. The city lights began to fade as morning rose over Seattle, soft and gray. Somewhere in that light, she made a quiet decision, not to leave in anger, not yet, but to leave, eventually, to find the version of herself that still remembered how to feel sunlight on her face. She closed the suitcase, the sound small and final, then she turned off the light, leaving the room in a calm, deliberate silence. Behind her, the drawer stayed shut, its secret waiting, its truth already spoken in the quietest way possible. The morning air was sharp when Evelyn stepped onto the platform. Her fingers tightened around the leather strap of her small travel bag, the kind she hadn't used in years. The station smelled faintly of iron and old paper tickets, the echo of wheels against rails filling the space between hurried footsteps. She had told no one where she was going, not even Richard. Especially not Richard. The train hissed as it pulled in, silver and streaked with rain. She climbed aboard, her pulse quick and uncertain, and found a seat by the window. The glass was cold beneath her fingertips. Outside, the city still looked half-asleep gray buildings, umbrellas opening like dark flowers, people walking fast but not really going anywhere. As the train began to move, the skyline slid away. Concrete turned to open fields, fields to forests, forests to long stretches of fog where the world felt weightless. Evelyn exhaled slowly. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't waiting on anyone. The thought was both terrifying and peaceful. She stirred the coffee she had bought from the station kiosk. It was already cooling, the bitter smell mixing with the faint sweetness of the pastry she hadn't touched. A child's laughter broke through the quiet. Across the aisle, a little boy pressed his nose to the window, pointing at cows grazing in the distance. His mother smiled, eyes soft, tired in a familiar way. Evelyn found herself smiling, too small, brief, almost forgotten. The rhythm of the train was hypnotic, steel on steel, wind through gaps, a steady heartbeat of motion and distance. She leaned her head against the window and watched the colors change, the dull gray of the city giving way to deep greens and, eventually, a stretch of blue at the horizon. The ocean. She hadn't realized how much she missed the sound of waves until that moment. When the conductor passed, she asked softly, "How long until Camden Bay?" "About an hour." He replied with a kind smile. "Nice little town. Quiet this time of year?" Quiet, that word again. But this quiet, she hoped, would be different. Not the kind that pressed down like a weight, but the kind that gave room to breathe. She reached into her coat pocket, feeling the worn edge of a photograph, the one she had found days ago, hidden in Richard's drawer. She hadn't planned to take it, but her hand had done it before her mind could object. Now it sat folded, unseen, a secret reminder of who he had once been and who she no longer was. She didn't look at it. She didn't have to. The image was etched into her mind already, his smile, that sunlight, a love that wasn't hers. The train curved along the coastline, through the window. The sea appeared gray-blue and vast, waves rolling lazily under a pale sky. Evelyn pressed her palm to the glass. The salt air seeped faintly through the vents, carrying the scent of seaweed and memory. Her throat tightened. She remembered summers long ago, before everything became complicated, walking barefoot through wet sand, laughing without thinking, believing love was enough to keep anything from breaking. Maybe she had been naive. Maybe that was her strength once. A man in the next row sneezed, jolting her back to the present. The child laughed again. Someone's coffee cup rattled in its holder. Life kept moving, unbothered. And that, she realized, was the hardest part of all. The world didn't stop when your heart did. She pulled a notebook from her bag, one she hadn't written in for years. The pages smelled faintly of dust. On the first blank page, she wrote a date, then hesitated. The pen hovered. She didn't know what to say. For so long, her words had been about someone else. She stared at the empty space until the letters finally came, uneven but honest. "I'm still here." The train slowed as it neared the coast. Small houses began to appear, white fences, laundry lines swaying in the breeze, children on bicycles chasing the morning light. Camden Bay was the kind of place where the air tasted different, where even silence felt gentle. Evelyn felt a small tremor of fear in her chest. Change was always like that, half freedom, half falling. When the train stopped, she stood and took her bag. The platform was wooden, painted blue at the edges, the paint chipped from years of salt and wind. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries sharp and familiar. She stepped down carefully, her heels clicking against the boards, and for a moment, The whole world seemed to exhale around her. Evelyn. The voice came from across the platform. She turned, startled, then smiled before she even saw her face fully. Grace, the friend she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with gray, but her eyes hadn't changed warm, knowing, alive. They moved toward each other at once, and when they hugged, Evelyn felt her composure dissolve. The smell of Grace's vanilla shampoo, the solid weight of another person's arms, it felt like coming home to something she didn't know she'd lost. Grace pulled back just enough to study her face. "You look like a ghost who forgot she used to be alive." Evelyn gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe I did." Grace tilted her head, not unkindly. "Then, let's see if we can remind her." They walked together toward the parking lot, the wind sweeping in from the ocean. Evelyn's bag felt lighter now, her steps less careful. The town stretched out before them, quiet streets, weathered cottages, the smell of salt and pine. "Still the same old Camden Bay," Grace said, gesturing toward the horizon. "Though it's slower now." "You'll like that." Evelyn nodded. "Slower sounds good." They drove along the coastline, windows slightly open, the sea breeze tangling her hair. For the first time in years, Evelyn wasn't thinking about what she had to do next. She just watched the light flicker across the waves, listened to the rhythm of tires against gravel, and let herself exist. The radio hummed softly, some old folk song that neither of them recognized. Grace glanced at her and smiled. "So, how long are you staying?" Evelyn looked out the window, the ocean stretching endlessly beside them. "I don't know yet." Grace nodded, understanding without pressing further. As they approached town, Evelyn saw a lighthouse in the distance, tall, steadfast, standing against the wind. Something about it made her chest ache. Maybe because it looked like hope, or maybe because it looked like solitude, the kind that could heal if you let it. The car slowed as they entered a narrow road lined with wild roses. Grace pointed ahead. "You'll stay with me tonight. We'll talk in the morning." Evelyn smiled faintly. "You always did make decisions for me. And you always needed someone to—" They parked near a small cottage painted pale yellow. The sound of the ocean was close now, waves breathing against the shore. Evelyn stepped out, feeling the wooden porch beneath her feet, smelling the salt and pine mixed together. It was all simple, quiet, real. Grace handed her a mug of tea once they were inside. "Drink. You'll feel human again." Evelyn laughed softly, the sound fragile but real. She sat by the window, cradling the mug in both hands, watching the fog roll in from the sea. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. Outside, a gull cried, the tide whispered against the rocks, and as the evening settled around Camden Bay, Evelyn realized she was breathing differently, deeper, steadier, like someone who might still have a life to return to. The ghost had begun to fade. The morning fog had lifted, leaving behind a soft gold shimmer on the horizon. Camden Bay stretched wide and quiet, the tide pulling gently against the sand. Evelyn walked beside Grace, their footprints weaving a crooked path behind them. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of salt and seaweed, and every breath felt cleaner somehow, as if the ocean had decided to rinse the world of noise. The gulls called overhead, their cries carried by the wind. Evelyn squinted at the light breaking through the clouds. It painted the water in ribbons of silver. She hadn't seen anything so alive in years. She hugged her sweater closer, the sleeves brushing against her fingers. Her hair whipped across her face, and she didn't bother to fix it. For once, it didn't matter. Grace walked a few steps ahead, holding her camera. "You still hate having your picture taken?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Depends who's holding the camera." Grace laughed. "Good answer?" They kept walking. Waves crashed softly near their feet, then retreated, leaving behind lines of white foam that melted back into the sea. Evelyn slowed down, letting her fingertips graze the air as if touching something invisible. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd allowed herself to just feel the wind, the sound, the space around her. The world here didn't ask for anything. It didn't need her to smile, to host, to hold everything together. It just let her be. Grace paused suddenly, raising the camera. "Don't move." Evelyn blinked. "What? Just stay like that?" Grace said, focusing. "Turn your face a little toward the water." The wind caught her hair again, lifting it just as the late afternoon sun slipped through the clouds. The light fell perfectly warm, golden, alive. Evelyn laughed, almost startled by the sound of it. Grace pressed the shutter. Click. The sound was small, but it carried. "Beautiful," Grace whispered. "Do you know what I see right now?" Evelyn looked down at the sand, smiling shyly, a woman with messy hair. Grace lowered the camera and shook her head. "No, I see the woman you were before the marriage, the one who used to run barefoot into the water without worrying who was watching." Evelyn's smile faded to something softer. The words sank deep. The sea roared behind them, as if agreeing. She turned toward the horizon, eyes tracing the edge where water met sky. "I don't know if she's still there," she said quietly. "She is," Grace replied. "You just forgot where to look." The breeze carried the scent of pine from the cliffs nearby. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sun warm her cheeks. When she opened them again, Grace was reviewing the photo on her camera screen. She held it out without a word. Evelyn leaned in. There she was, caught in motion, her hair wild, her lips curved into a real smile. The light haloed her face, the sea behind her a blur of blue and silver. It didn't look like a posed picture. It looked like a memory that had been waiting for her to come back. For a heartbeat, she didn't breathe. It wasn't the beauty that struck her. It was recognition. She had spent so long feeling invisible that really seeing herself, felt almost unbearable. There was no exhaustion in that face, no hesitation, just life. Grace smiled softly. "That's you. Evie." Evelyn swallowed. Her throat felt tight. "I look happy." "You are. Maybe not all the way, but enough." They walked again, slower this time. The tide was rising, waves slipping over their shoes. Neither of them cared. Grace talked about her photography project portraits of women rediscovering who they were after loss. Evelyn listened, half present, half lost in the picture still glowing in her mind. Every few steps, she touched her pocket, feeling the folded print Grace had insisted she keep. "For you," she'd said, "proof of life." The sun dipped lower, casting the beach in a honey-colored light. The sand sparkled, the ocean glimmered, and everything seemed touched by something kind. Evelyn looked around, memorizing it, the sound, the light, the feeling of her pulse matching the rhythm of the waves. It wasn't escape she felt, it was return. They stopped near a cluster of driftwood where the tide reached higher. Grace sat down, camera in her lap. Evelyn stood beside her, watching the sky turn amber and rose. The breeze carried strands of hair across her face again, and she laughed quietly, brushing them away. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "if we choose the wrong version of ourselves to love?" Grace tilted her head. "What do you mean, I think Richard fell in love with who I was when I made him feel safe?" Evelyn said, her voice soft but steady. "And I fell in love with the man who made me feel seen. But somewhere along the way, we both stopped being those people." Grace looked up at her. "Then, maybe this trip isn't about finding him. Maybe it's about finding you." Evelyn nodded. "Maybe." The waves hissed over the sand, then slipped back again, endless, patient. She reached into her pocket, unfolded the photo. The paper fluttered in the breeze. The woman in the picture looked free, unguarded, open, real. Evelyn smiled at her. "I used to think happiness was something someone could give me," she said quietly. Now, I think it's something I just forgot how to keep. Grace said nothing. She didn't need to. The sea answered for her, a steady rhythm that made words unnecessary. They stayed until the sun disappeared completely, leaving behind a soft indigo glow. When they finally turned to leave, Evelyn tucked the photo carefully back into her coat. She held it close, feeling the edges press against her heart. Back at the cottage, Grace brewed tea while Evelyn stood by the window, the sky darkening beyond the glass. The sound of the ocean rolled through the night, steady and familiar. Evelyn ran her thumb along the folded photo again. She didn't know yet how much that image would change her life. She only knew it felt like the first real thing she'd owned in years. Outside, the waves kept their rhythm. Inside, Evelyn breathed in time with them. For once, her reflection in the window didn't look like a stranger. It looked like someone on the edge of remembering who she was. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Night fell softly over Camden Bay, wrapping the town in the hush of waves and the faint hum of distant crickets. Inside Grace's cottage, the lights were dim, the kind of warm yellow that made everything look gentler than it was. Evelyn sat by the small window, her tea untouched, her phone glowing faintly against her hand. Outside, the tide rolled in and out like steady breathing. The photo lay beside her on the table, the one Grace had taken that afternoon. Her smile in it still startled her. It didn't look like someone pretending. It looked like freedom, raw and quiet. For hours, she had stared at it, unsure what to do with the strange feeling it stirred. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed herself until she saw that face looking back. Grace was washing dishes in the kitchen, humming softly to an old folk song on the radio. The sound of running water mixed with the creak of the wooden floor and the whisper of wind against the window. It was one of those moments where everything felt suspended ordinary, yet tender. Without thinking too much, Evelyn unlocked her phone. She opened her old social account, one she hadn't used in months. The cursor blinked in the empty caption box. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Then, slowly, she typed, "Learning to breathe again." "Thank you. Camden Bay." She attached the photo. For a brief moment, she almost deleted it, but something inside her, the small, steady voice that had been silent for too long, whispered, "Let it live." She hit post. The screen refreshed, and the image appeared on her profile, framed in light, her name beneath it. That smile. For the first time in years. She didn't care who might see. She set the phone aside, exhaling softly. Grace turned from the sink. "Everything okay?" Evelyn nodded. "Yeah, just letting something go." Grace dried her hands, studying her friend for a moment. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "It does." They spent the next hour talking about small things, recipes, local shops, the storm expected tomorrow. But beneath it all, Evelyn felt a quiet shift, as if she had cracked open a window in a long-closed room. Later, when Grace went to bed, Evelyn stayed by the window, watching the moonlight ripple across the sea. Her phone buzzed once, twice, then a few messages, likes, old friends leaving comments, "Beautiful, you look happy." "Miss you." She smiled at the kindness in those words. None of them knew what the picture really meant. To them, it was just a photograph. To her, it was air. She fell asleep with the sound of waves in her ears, unaware that the world outside that quiet room was already stirring. Miles away, in a city that never really slept. The post began to move. A friend shared it, then another. A journalist who had once met her at a charity gala commented, "Within hours." The image had found its way beyond her circle, passed along, admired, reshared, and half a world away, in Tokyo. A ballroom glittered under chandeliers, the hum of conversation, the clink of crystal, the low murmur of business and ambition filled the air. Richard Hale stood near the bar, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand. His suit was immaculate. His expression composed the look of a man who had everything under control. His phone buzzed. He ignored it at first, lost in a conversation about market expansion and mergers. Then it buzzed again. A colleague glanced at the screen. "Your wife's trending," he joked lightly, sliding his own phone forward. Richard frowned, confused. "What?" The man tilted his device so he could see. "Look, Evelyn Hale, Camden Bay. It's everywhere. Beautiful shot, by the way." Richard's eyes locked on the screen, and there she was. Evelyn, standing against the sea, sunlight in her hair, laughing as the wind tangled it. For a moment, everything around him went silent. He didn't hear the music, didn't see the chandeliers, didn't feel the weight of the glass in his hand. All he saw was her. Not the woman who waited quietly in their apartment, who spoke softly and moved carefully so she wouldn't disturb his thoughts. This woman looked alive, radiant, free. He swallowed hard, the noise of the party rushing back all at once. Someone beside him asked a question, something about Tokyo contracts, but the words didn't land. His pulse pounded in his ears. He opened the caption, "Learning to breathe again. Thank you. Camden Bay." He read it once, then again. His throat tightened. In that moment, he saw joy he hadn't given her in years. Richard stepped away from the table, the noise pressing in from every side. He found himself outside on the balcony, the city lights blurring below him. His reflection in the glass looked pale, hollow, almost unrecognizable. He scrolled again, staring at her face, the curve of her smile, the peace in her eyes. Something in him cracked, not loud, not visible, but deep. He thought about the last time she'd smiled like that. It was years ago, before the company, before the endless flights, before silence had become their common language. He had forgotten what that sound was like, her laughter carried by wind. The photo had captured something he'd lost long ago, and he hated that it took a stranger's lens to show him. He checked the timestamp. Posted 3 hours ago. Camden Bay, Maine. He closed his eyes. He could almost smell the ocean just from reading the words. He remembered taking her there once, years ago, when their marriage was still new. They'd talked about buying a small cottage near the cliffs. He'd promised they'd return every summer. He never kept that promise. Now she was there, without him. A gust of wind swept through the balcony, stirring his hair. Somewhere below, traffic moved like veins of light. He stood there for a long time, phone heavy in his hand, the echo of that image burning in his chest. He wanted to call her, to say something, anything. But what could he say to the woman who had finally learned to breathe without him? The ballroom doors opened behind him. Someone called his name. He didn't answer. He looked at the picture one more time, zoomed in slightly. Her eyes caught the light just right. She looked happy, truly happy, and for the first time in years, Richard felt afraid that the silence he'd built so carefully had finally spoken louder than any apology he could give. He slipped the phone into his pocket, turned back toward the crowd, and smiled the way powerful men do, outwardly calm, inwardly unraveling. Somewhere, music played, laughter filled the room, but in his chest, there was only the sound of waves, soft, steady, pulling something precious away. And though he didn't know it yet, that one photographed the light in her eyes. The smile that wasn't his had already changed everything. The city lights of Tokyo bled into the night like spilled ink. Richard sat alone in his hotel suite, the glass walls offering a panoramic view of a skyline that should have made him feel powerful. Instead, it only made him feel small. The photo still glowed on his phone screen, bright against the dim room. Evelyn, standing by the sea. The same woman he had once held so close, now impossibly far. He couldn't look away. There was something in her eyes, a quiet joy, unforced, unperformed, a joy that had nothing to do with him. He set the phone face down, then picked it up again seconds later. Every time he blinked, the image stayed burned behind his eyelids. That smile, that sunlight, that sentence learning to breathe again. He leaned back on the couch, exhaling hard. The champagne glass from earlier still sat on the table, untouched, the bubbles long gone. The air smelled faintly of cologne and city dust. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed a woman's voice, carefree and distant. Richard rubbed the back of his neck, a tension rising there that wouldn't leave. He had spent his entire adult life building control, controlling numbers, outcomes, emotions. He knew how to manage everything except this, except the feeling that was twisting through his chest like a slow burn. Jealousy. He didn't want to name it. But that's what it was. He got up and began to pace the room. The carpet softened his steps, but his thoughts were loud. Why does it hurt? He murmured to himself. If she's happy, he stopped by the window. Below, Tokyo shimmered alive, relentless. Neon signs pulsed like heartbeats. He had always admired cities that never slept. Now the energy felt suffocating. Why did it hurt? She wasn't his possession. She was his wife. Or at least, she had been. But he'd built their marriage like one of his skyscrapers, impressive on the outside, empty inside. And yet, seeing her now, smiling in the sunlight of another life, felt like losing something he hadn't even realized was missing. He poured himself a drink, then didn't touch it. The amber liquid caught the light. He stared at it for a long moment before setting it aside. The quiet pressed in. The only sound was the faint hum of the city through the glass. He sat back down, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. The memory of her laughter, real laughter, not polite smiles at charity dinners, rose from somewhere deep in his mind. He remembered the sound, how it used to fill rooms, how it used to make him forget the noise of everything else. When had that stopped? Maybe it was after the second promotion. Maybe it was after the first missed anniversary. Maybe it was when he started believing that success would somehow take care of love for him. He looked at the phone again. The post now had thousands of likes, comments from strangers calling her radiant, beautiful, strong. Each one felt like a small pinprick. He scrolled through them all, his thumb moving slower with every word. It wasn't vanity. It was the realization that the woman the world was seeing now wasn't the one who had been living quietly beside him all those years. He had traded something sacred for something shiny, and now all the shine in the world couldn't fill the hollow space she'd left behind. The clock on the wall ticked softly, past midnight. His meeting notes lay untouched on the desk. He picked up the phone again, stared at her name in his contacts. It felt strange how a simple name could hold years of history. He pressed call. The dial tone echoed in his ear. Once, twice. Then her voice recorded, gentle, distant. "You've reached Evelyn. Leave a message after the beep." For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then, quietly, "I saw your photo. Please call me." He ended the call. The sound of the beep lingered in his mind longer than it should have. He waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. He checked the phone again. No message, no missed call. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling faintly against the glass. Richard stood again, restless. His reflection looked older tonight. The sharp lines of his suit didn't hide the weariness in his eyes. He tried to go over the speech he was supposed to give at tomorrow's conference, words about growth, leadership, stability, but each line felt meaningless. How could he talk about building empires when his own foundation was crumbling in silence? He looked at the bed, perfectly made, cold. His thoughts looped back to that question. Why does it hurt if she's happy? The answer came quietly. Because her happiness proved he was no longer needed. Because somewhere along the way, she had found a life beyond him, and he hadn't realized he'd been standing still. He pressed his palms against his face, breathing deep, trying to chase away the ache that refused to fade. The hotel room suddenly felt too clean, too still, too far from anything real. He opened the curtains wider. Tokyo sprawled beneath him, glittering and indifferent. He thought of Evelyn by the sea, the wind in her hair, laughter in her throat. He could almost hear the waves. And for the first time in years, he wished he were anywhere but here. He reached for his phone again, fingers trembling slightly. He checked the time, 2:17 more. He didn't care. He called her again, the same voicemail, the same soft tone. This time, he didn't speak, he just listened. When the beep came, he hung up. He stood there for a while, his hand still on the phone, his chest tight. Then he made a decision without thinking, instinctive, desperate, certain. He picked up his passport, he opened his laptop, typed quickly, his breath unsteady. One-way ticket, Tokyo to Seattle, first available flight. He entered his card number and hit confirm. The confirmation email appeared seconds later. Departure, 6:45 a.m. He glanced at the clock. 4 hours. He sat down again, staring at the photo on his phone one last time. She looked happy. That should have been enough for him, but it wasn't. Because happiness, when it no longer included him, didn't feel peaceful. It felt like punishment. Outside, dawn began to creep into the edge of the sky. The city was still buzzing, but he didn't see it anymore. He was already somewhere else in his mind, in his heart, standing on a shoreline he hadn't visited in years. He turned off the lights, grabbed his suitcase, and left the room without looking back. Somewhere above Tokyo, the first streaks of sunlight broke through the clouds. Richard Hale, the man who had built everything, was finally chasing the one thing he'd let slip through his fingers, and he didn't even know yet if it was too late. Seattle was asleep when Richard returned. The streets glistened under a thin drizzle, the kind that left the city breathing steam. His driver dropped him at the curb before dawn, the skyline behind him muted in fog. He let himself into the penthouse, the door unlocking with a sound too sharp for a home that hadn't felt like one in years. The lights were off. He didn't turn them on. The air was still, carrying faint traces of her perfume, the one that lingered in curtains and memories. He set his bag down, loosened his tie, and stood there, letting the silence press against him. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed, steady and indifferent. He walked through each room like a stranger touring someone else's life. The couch where she used to read. The table still bearing the faint ring of her teacup. Even the vase she had filled with lilies wilted now, their petals curled and pale. Everything was exactly where she'd left it. Only she wasn't. He sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, phone in hand. The screen lit up his face in the dark. Evelyn's photo stared back at him. That same smile, that same light. When did I stop seeing her? He whispered. His own voice startled him. It sounded smaller than he remembered. He swiped through his gallery, searching for something, any picture of her. There weren't many. A handful from old events, formal dinners, magazine features. She looked beautiful, always poised, but never like the woman in that beach photo, never free. He leaned back, head against the couch, eyes closed. The city murmured outside, the distant hum of cars, the faint whistle of wind between glass towers. He used to love that sound. Now it only reminded him how high up he was, how far from everything real. His phone buzzed, a message from his assistant. Reminder, Tokyo follow-up meeting, Thursday, 9 a.m. He deleted it. Then, almost without thinking, he opened a map app, typed the words slowly, as if testing them. Camden Bay, Maine. The screen blinked, zooming out, then back in. A red pin appeared on the edge of the country, small, remote, surrounded by blue. He stared at it for a long time. A rational man would have sent flowers, an apology, a plane ticket, but reason had built him a life of marble floors and empty beds. Reason had turned love into a series of polite gestures. This time, he didn't want reason. He wanted to see her. Richard grabbed his keys from the counter, The metal felt cold in his palm. He didn't pack, he didn't even change. He just took his coat, his wallet, and walked out. The elevator ride down felt endless, the soft chime of each passing floor echoing like the seconds of a decision he couldn't undo. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city glowed in wet reflections. He climbed into his car, the leather seat creaking under his weight. The dashboard clock read 4:12 a.m. He started the engine. The low rumble filled the quiet. He drove. Highways unfurled beneath the tires, slick and black. Seattle's lights fell away in the rearview mirror, swallowed by fog. The radio stayed off. He didn't need noise. The rhythm of the wipers, the hum of the tires, those were enough. The further he went, the lighter the sky became. He crossed small towns still sleeping, past diners with flickering neon signs, gas stations glowing like lone beacons on the edge of nowhere. He stopped once for coffee. It tasted burnt, but it kept him awake. Hours blurred into each other. Washington faded into Oregon, then into the open stretches of the interstate. The horizon stretched wide and gray, endless as regret. Every mile pulled him further from the empire he'd built and closer to the life he'd forgotten. He thought about her, how she used to tuck her hair behind her ear when she read, how she hummed softly when she cooked, how she once left little notes in his briefcase. "Don't forget to eat. Good luck today." He hadn't noticed when those notes stopped. He hadn't asked why. The road curved along the coastline. Somewhere in the distance, waves crashed against cliffs. He rolled down the window, letting the wind cut through the stale air of the car. The scent of salt filled his lungs. For the first time in years, he felt something close to alive, but it came with fear. What if she didn't want to see him? What if she had found something or someone better? The thought hit like a blade twisting quietly inside his chest. He gripped the wheel tighter, eyes fixed on the road. The memory of her voice echoed in his mind. Good night. The way she had said it, soft, resigned, final. He had thought it was just another night. He hadn't realized it was the beginning of goodbye. He drove through the night, guided by headlights and guilt. Somewhere along the way, snow began to fall, thin flakes drifting down like ash. He turned the heat up, his fingers stiff from the cold. The rhythm of the wipers slowed with the storm. When fatigue finally crept in, he pulled over at a rest stop. The lot was empty, silent except for the whisper of wind through pines. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the engine idle. In the darkness behind his eyelids, her face appeared again. The photo, that smile, the words learning to breathe again. He exhaled shakily. "Maybe I should have learned with you," he murmured. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. At dawn, he started driving again. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thin veil of mist that clung to the world. As the sun rose, the light broke through in soft gold streaks, catching on the edges of the road, turning the wet pavement into glass. The GPS voice spoke softly. "Welcome to Camden Bay." Richard slowed the car. Rolling down the window, the smell of salt and pine hit him at once. The ocean stretched ahead, vast, silent, shimmering under the morning light. Seagulls drifted above the water, their cries faint but piercing. He pulled over near a narrow path leading to the beach. The sand glistened under a blanket of thin fog. He stepped out, the cold air biting at his skin, the ground crunching under his shoes. He stood there for a long moment, watching the waves roll in, slow and steady. Sorrow, relief, and fear tangled somewhere deep inside him. He had no plan, no words, just the ache of everything he had broken. The wind off the ocean stung his eyes. Or maybe it wasn't the wind. He whispered, "I'm here." The sound disappeared into the mist behind him. The sky began to brighten, streaks of gold threading through the clouds. The world smelled of rain and second chances. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Hale let himself feel the weight of everything he'd lost, and the fragile hope of what might still be found. The wind was sharp that morning, carrying the taste of salt and rain. The ocean stretched wide and gray, waves curling and breaking against the rocks with a rhythm that felt ancient, patient. Evelyn sat on one of the larger stones near the shore, her coat pulled tight around her. The hood framed her face, strands of hair escaping and whipping across her cheek. She didn't brush them away. She just watched the sea, its endless motion, its quiet defiance. Behind her, the sound of tires crunching gravel broke the steady pulse of the waves. She didn't turn. She knew who it was. Some part of her had known he would come. The way you can feel a storm hours before it arrives. Richard stopped a few paces away, the wind tugging at his coat. He looked exhausted, his eyes hollow from the long drive, his face drawn from nights without sleep. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound between them was the water folding onto itself, over and over again. He finally said, quietly, "Evelyn?" Her name sounded strange in his mouth, soft, almost fragile. She didn't answer. He stepped closer, but not enough to bridge the space between them. "I didn't know where else to go," he said. His voice trembled slightly, barely audible against the wind. She kept her eyes on the horizon. "You found me easily enough. I saw the photo. I know." He waited for her to say more, but she didn't. He looked down at the stones beneath his shoes, then back at her. "You looked happy." Her laugh was short, quiet. "That's what scared you, wasn't it?" He flinched at the truth in her tone. "I know. I didn't realize." She turned to face him. Finally, her eyes were calm, but there was a weight there that made him take a small step back. "Didn't realize what?" "Richard, that I could still feel alive, that the world didn't stop because you forgot to look." He opened his mouth, but no words came. Evelyn looked away again, to the sea. "I spent years waiting for you to see me. I thought if I stayed quiet, patient, loving, you'd come back to the man you used to be. But you were already gone, weren't you?" Richard's throat tightened. "That's not fair." She turned back to him, voice steady. "Then tell me, did you ever love me, or just the idea of me?" The wind dropped for a moment. Even the ocean seemed to pause. He closed his eyes. "I did love you," but his silence said everything. She looked at him, really looked. The man standing before her was the same one who had once written her letters, left notes in her books, traced constellations with her on summer nights. But something had broken in him, long before their marriage had. "Tell me the truth," she said softly. "All of it." He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling like the tide. "There was someone before you," he began. "Her name was Laura Benton. We were engaged. It ended badly. I know." Evelyn said, "I found the photos." He nodded, shame flickering across his face. "I walked away from her. I thought it was the right thing to do back then. We were young, reckless. And when things fell apart, she lost the baby." "My child?" Evelyn froze. The sound of the waves seemed to grow distant. "I didn't know how to face it," Richard continued, voice cracking. "I buried myself in work. I told myself I could build something stronger, cleaner. And then I met you. You were light. Evelyn. You made me believe I could be someone different. But I never really dealt with the man I was before." She stared at him, the pieces of the past falling quietly into place. "You saw me as a way to start over," she said. He nodded. "I wanted to love you right, but I was still haunted by what I'd done. Every time you looked at me with trust, I felt like I was lying." Evelyn swallowed hard. "So you built a wall instead." He met her eyes. "Yes." "And behind that wall," she said, a voice trembling, "you let me disappear." The silence that followed was heavy. Richard wanted to step closer, to touch her hand, to explain, but there was nothing left to explain. Only the ache of things too long unsaid. "I never wanted to hurt you," he whispered. You didn't want to, she said, but you did. Her voice cracked on the last word. She turned away, her shoulders trembling. The tears came quietly, the kind that carried exhaustion more than rage. Richard stood helpless, watching her break in the same way he once had alone, quietly, without anyone noticing. He took one hesitant step closer. I should have told you about Laura, about everything. But I thought if I pretended hard enough, it would all fade. I thought love could erase the past. She shook her head. Love doesn't erase. It remembers and forgives. But you never gave it the chance. He exhaled shakily, his breath visible in the cold air. You're right. The waves rose higher, crashing against the rocks. She looked out at them, her tears catching the wind. You know, she said softly, I used to envy the ocean. No matter how hard the storm hits, it finds its rhythm again. Maybe people can't do that. Maybe we just drown slower. He stepped beside her then, not touching, just close enough that the space between them felt smaller. Maybe, he said, we can learn. She looked at him, her eyes red, but there was something gentler there now, a small, reluctant mercy. For a long moment, they stood together, watching the horizon where the sky met the sea. She said, almost to herself, I don't hate you, Richard, but I don't know how to love you anymore. The words hit him like a quiet truth, heavy and final. He nodded, unable to speak. The wind shifted, carrying the faint cry of a gull overhead. Evelyn wiped her face with the back of her hand, her breathing slow. He whispered, I'm sorry. She closed her eyes. I know. Her voice was soft, and somehow that hurt more than anger. For a long while, neither moved. The waves kept rolling in, the morning light breaking through the fog in thin, golden strands. It fell across her face, across the lines of grief and grace she no longer tried to hide. Richard looked at her and realized this was the closest they had been in years, not in distance, but in truth. And as the tide climbed higher, she began to cry again, not out of fury this time, but something deeper. The kind of sorrow that only comes when you finally understand the person who hurt you. He didn't reach for her. He just stood there, letting her tears fall between them like rain. Because some things weren't meant to be fixed in a single moment. They were meant to be felt. The sea roared once more, and the wind carried their silence out to the horizon, where endings and beginnings often looked the same. The tide had pulled back, leaving thin veins of foam along the sand. The morning light had sharpened, the air smelled of salt and seaweed. Evelyn stood near the water's edge, arms wrapped around herself. Behind her, Richard sat on a weathered log, eyes down, the collar of his coat turned up against the cold. Neither spoke. They'd run out of small words. After a long while, he said, There's something else I need to tell you. His voice was rough, the kind that carried both exhaustion and confession. Evelyn didn't move, didn't turn around. Only her breath made small clouds in the air. I met Laura again, he continued. After we were married, Evelyn closed her eyes, the sound of his words sinking into the rhythm of the waves. It wasn't physical, he said quickly. It wasn't an affair, not in that way. But I need you to know it happened. She turned then, slowly. When, about 2 years ago, she came to one of the fundraisers, she said she wanted closure. We had coffee a few times. Her gaze was steady, too steady. Coffee? He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. We talked, that's all. But I told her things I should have told you. I shared parts of myself I'd kept locked away. I didn't see it then. But it was betrayal all the same. She let out a quiet, trembling breath. That's worse. He looked up, startled. Worse. Yes. Her voice cracked, soft but cutting. Because it means you could still feel. You just chose not to feel with me. Richard's shoulders sagged. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was lonely, she said. finishing for him. So was I. The wind shifted, carrying gull cries across the shore. He pressed a hand to his face. For a moment, he looked older, smaller, human. She reached out again. He said finally, "A few weeks ago." After the photo went viral, she saw it, said she couldn't believe how happy you looked, without me. She sounded bitter, angry. She said I deserved to lose everything. Evelyn frowned. What does she want? She wants attention, he said, or revenge, maybe both. She said she'd tell the press about us, about how I left her, about the baby. She said the world deserves to know what kind of man I really am. Evelyn stared out at the water, her reflection scattered by waves. Maybe she's right. He winced, but didn't argue. The sky had darkened. A heavy cloud moved in from the horizon. He could smell the rain coming. I told her to stop. He said, "To leave us alone." Us, Evelyn repeated quietly, as if testing the word. He hesitated. Evelyn. Before he could finish, his phone rang. The sound shattered the fragile stillness between them. He fumbled it from his pocket, the name flashing on the screen. Laura Benton? Evelyn saw it too. Her stomach turned. He answered, voice low. Laura. Whatever she said on the other end made the color drain from his face. No, don't, Laura. Please, don't do this. He stood, pacing. I said I was sorry. I meant it. But this won't fix anything. The call ended. The wind roared louder. He turned toward Evelyn, panic in his eyes. She did it. Evelyn's expression didn't change. What did she do? She sent it to the press. Everything. Our marriage. The photos. The baby. Everything. The first raindrop hit her cheek. She didn't flinch. Within minutes, his phone began buzzing non-stop calls, alerts, messages stacking faster than he could read. Headlines were already appearing. His name, hers, Laura's. The story spreading like wildfire. He dropped the phone into the sand. The screen cracked. God, he whispered. It's everywhere. Evelyn turned toward the sea again, her hair whipping in the wind. Now the whole world will see who we really are. Her voice was calm, almost eerily so. Richard stared at her. You don't deserve this. No, she said. But maybe it's the only way for you to finally face it. He looked down, water pooling around his shoes as the tide crept higher. They'll destroy everything I built. Maybe what you built needed to fall, she said softly. The rain began in earnest, cold and relentless. It soaked through their coats, their hair, their silence. For a long time, they stood there, two people stripped of everything but truth. She watched the waves crash harder, churning white and furious. Do you remember when you said love could fix anything? He nodded. Barely? You were wrong, she said. Love doesn't fix. It reveals. Her words settled between them like ash. He tried to speak, but the sound of the storm swallowed him whole. His empire, his control, his careful image, none of it mattered now. The ocean didn't care who he was. He looked at her one last time, rain sliding down his face like tears he didn't know how to cry. I'll fix this, he said. She shook her head. You can't fix the truth. Richard, you can only tell it. Her coat clung to her frame, her eyes tired but steady. For a brief second, lightning flashed over the horizon, lighting up her face, the pain, the strength, the quiet dignity, and just like that, the sky opened wider, pouring everything it had. He bent to pick up his phone, wiping the screen with the edge of his sleeve. Dozens of notifications blurred under his trembling fingers, calls from his PR team, messages from investors, headlines flashing his downfall. He didn't answer any of them. He looked back toward her, standing against the storm, unflinching. Something in him broke again, not from shame this time, but from awe. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't running. She was simply standing. The woman he had ignored was now the only one who still faced the truth with grace. He stepped closer, his voice nearly drowned by the wind. "Evelyn." She didn't look at him. "Go, Richard, handle what's yours. Let the world see you for who you are. I'll be here, watching the tide come in." He hesitated, wanting to reach out, wanting to stay. But the moment was already gone. The storm would decide the rest. He turned away, heading back toward the car, each step heavy in the sand. The rain blurred the edges of everything: his path, his purpose, his name. Behind him, Evelyn stood alone on the shore, the wind lifting her hair, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Lightning flashed again, reflected in her eyes. "Now," she whispered to no one in particular, "maybe we can finally stop pretending." The ocean roared in answer. And somewhere far away, the first headline hit the world like thunder. The press room smelled faintly of metal and coffee. Cameras clicked in staccato bursts, flashes blooming like lightning against the glass walls. Outside, the sky over Seattle hung low and gray, heavy with rain that hadn't yet fallen. Inside, 100 eyes were waiting for him to speak. Richard Hale stood behind the podium, hands gripping its edges. His suit was perfectly tailored, but it hung on him differently now, looser, as though the weight inside had shifted. The noise in the room hummed with restless energy, reporters whispering, phones buzzing, microphones adjusting. Every lens pointed straight at him. Evelyn stood a few steps to his right. She hadn't wanted to come, but she did. Not for him, not for the company, but for the truth. Her face was calm, unreadable, her posture steady. She wasn't there to defend him. She was there to witness him. Richard cleared his throat. The mic caught even the smallest tremor. "Thank you all for being here," he began. The sound of his own voice startled him. It was thinner than he remembered, stripped of confidence. "There's been a great deal said about me these past few days. Some of it true, some of it not. But what I need to say now, what I owe to say, is mine." He paused. 1,000 shutters fired in rhythm. He looked down once, then up again, meeting the eyes of the room. "For years," he said slowly, "I've built a life on perfection, the right image, the right numbers, the right story. I thought if I could make the world believe I was in control, then I'd be safe from the truth. But the truth has a way of waiting." The room fell silent. The hum of the lights filled the gaps between words. "I made mistakes," he continued. "I hurt people who didn't deserve it. I walked away when I should have stayed, and in doing so, I lost the only thing that ever mattered." He stopped again, the air heavy. Evelyn's eyes stayed on him steady, but not soft. He took a shallow breath. "Laura Benton was part of my past. Evelyn Hale is part of my heart. Both of them were real. Both of them carried the weight of who I used to be. I tried to bury the man I was, but he followed me into every boardroom, every press photo, every empty night. Someone coughed, someone else whispered, pen scratching paper." Richard leaned closer to the mic. "I built an empire on lies," he said, his voice breaking, "and lost the only truth I had. There was no applause, only silence, the kind that felt both punishing and merciful." Evelyn watched him, her throat tight. He didn't look at her, not yet. He looked out over the crowd, at the faces that had once admired him, envied him, feared him. "I won't ask for forgiveness," he said. "I've spent too long asking for the wrong things. All I can do is stand here, as I am, and take whatever comes." Flashes exploded again, harsh and relentless. A reporter shouted, "Mr. Hale, will you resign?" He nodded once. "Yes." The word rippled through the room like thunder. "Effective immediately," he continued. "I'm stepping down as CEO of Hale Global. I'll work with the board to ensure a full transition. The company deserves leadership built on integrity, not performance." "Do you regret the past?" another reporter called out. Richard looked down at his hands, the knuckles white against the wood. "Every day," he said softly. The room erupted with more questions, more noise. He stood there, unmoving, letting it wash over him. Then he glanced at Evelyn. Just for a second, the noise seemed to fall away again. She stepped forward not to comfort, not to share the stage, but simply to stand beside him. It was quiet between them, the kind of quiet that said everything words couldn't. When he finally stepped away from the podium, flashes followed him down the steps. He walked through the crowd of reporters, ignoring the calls, the microphones pushed toward his face. Evelyn followed at a short distance, her heels clicking softly against the floor. They reached the hallway beyond the conference room. It was empty, except for the muffled chaos left behind them. Richard stopped, leaning against the wall, his shoulders slumped. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights. Evelyn's voice came first, low and even. "That was the first honest thing you've ever done." He turned to her. There was no triumph in her tone, no warmth either, just truth. He nodded, eyes glistening. "It took me too long to learn how." "You can't undo what's been done," she said. "I know, but you can stop pretending." He let out a slow, uneven breath. "I don't even know who I am without pretending." "You'll find out," she said quietly. "That's the only thing worth doing now." For a while, they stood in silence again. The sound of rain finally began outside, soft against the glass walls of the lobby. It sounded like relief. She looked at him, really looked, not through anger this time, but through fatigue and memory. "You always thought the world would fall apart if you told the truth," she said. "But maybe this is what falling apart looks like when it finally sets you free." He swallowed hard, unable to answer. She adjusted her coat, ready to leave. "I'm not coming home," she said. He nodded slowly. "I know, I don't hate you," she added after a pause, "but I need to remember what peace feels like." Her words landed softly, like rain on still water. He didn't try to stop her. He just watched as she walked away, her reflection sliding across the wet marble floor. Outside, the press still waited, their umbrellas open, cameras ready. Evelyn stepped past them without a word, her face calm under the rain. The flashes followed her too, but she didn't flinch. Richard stayed behind, hands still trembling. He looked down at the podium through the glass, now empty under the harsh lights, the microphones, the scattered papers, the echoes of his confession. It all looked smaller now. He walked to the window, pressing his palm against the cool glass. The city blurred under rain, its lights smudged like watercolors. For the first time in years, he felt something that wasn't control or fear. It was something simpler, something clean. Maybe truth didn't ruin people. Maybe it stripped them down until there was nothing left but what was real. Behind him, the reporters shouted questions into the storm. He didn't turn back. He just stood there, letting the noise fade behind the glass, the rain sliding down like tears he no longer needed to hide. And somewhere in the distance, Evelyn walked down the steps into the gray Seattle morning, her face lifted, eyes open, untouched by the chaos she left behind. She didn't look back either. Some endings, she thought, didn't need doors closing, just silence. And that silence, for the first time, felt honest. The world didn't end with an explosion. It ended quietly. One morning, Richard woke up to find his phone filled with numbers that no longer meant anything. Shares, losses, names of people who wouldn't answer his calls anymore. The company had voted him out. His accounts were frozen. His calendar was blank. For years, he had been surrounded by movement calls, cars, assistants, cameras. Now there was only stillness, the kind that echoed. His penthouse felt even larger now, every sound bouncing off the marble and glass. He walked through it like a ghost visiting his own success. The paintings, the imported furniture, the bottles of wine he'd once collected, they all looked like artifacts from a man he no longer knew. A letter slid under the door one morning. It wasn't from a lawyer or a journalist. It was from Evelyn. "I'm not gone, but I'm not coming back yet. That was all it said. No accusation, no promise, just distance. He folded the letter and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. It became his most valuable possession. Days turned into weeks. His name slowly disappeared from headlines, replaced by newer scandals. But whispers lingered, the kind that followed you into elevators and across restaurants. That's him, people would say. Not with awe, but pity. His old friends vanished too. The ones who used to toast to his victories stopped returning his calls. His business partners found polite excuses. The board moved on. At night, he'd walk through the empty rooms, lights off, city humming below. Sometimes he caught himself talking to Evelyn aloud, as if she were still there, asking what she'd think of the quiet, of the emptiness, of him. He started taking the bus. It was strange at first, sitting among strangers, no driver waiting, no tinted windows. But it grounded him, the sound of the brakes, the soft chatter, the simple rhythm of people just going somewhere. He'd stop by the market, buying groceries himself. The cashier never recognized him. That anonymity felt almost holy. Some nights, he'd sit by the window and write. He had nothing left to build but words. He wrote to Evelyn, not to win her back, but to understand himself. The first letter was messy, almost desperate. Then they became quieter, honest. One evening, he wrote, "If I can't earn your love again, let me at least earn your respect." He read it twice before sealing the envelope. He didn't expect an answer, but the act of sending it, of putting it into the mailbox with his own hand, felt like breathing again after holding it too long. The next week, he received a small postcard, no return address, just a photo of the sea at Camden Bay. On the back, in her handwriting, "Respect starts with truth. Keep going." He stared at those words for a long time, the edges of the card softening under his fingers. So he did. He sold the penthouse. Quietly. No statements. No interviews. He moved into a small apartment near the harbor, where gulls screamed in the morning and the smell of coffee drifted through the thin walls. He spent his days reading, walking, learning to cook simple things. One afternoon, while waiting for laundry to finish, he found himself helping the building's janitor fix a broken heater. The man didn't know who he was, just thanked him, handed him a screwdriver, and told him stories about his grandkids. Richard listened, really listened. It had been years since he'd done that without looking at a clock. He started volunteering at a local community center, accounting, small business planning, teaching people how to manage money. The irony wasn't lost on him. He used to move billions. Now he helped people budget grocery bills. But it felt real in a way nothing else had. Sometimes he'd walk by the waterfront in the evenings, the wind sharp, his breath visible. The world had shrunk, but it fit him better this way. He thought about Evelyn often, not as the woman waiting for him at home, but as the person who had finally taught him what home meant. He didn't call her, didn't write again. He had said enough. The rest had to be lived, not spoken. Winter came. The city turned silver and slow. He watched people hurry past, bundled in coats, their breath fogging the air. He realized, for the first time in decades, that he had no meetings to rush to, no one expecting him, no one fearing him. It was terrifying and freeing. Sometimes, when the sun dipped behind the cranes at the harbor, he'd close his eyes and imagine her there, somewhere by the sea, maybe smiling, maybe not, but alive, whole. That thought was enough to keep him steady. One evening, as snow began to fall, he found another envelope in his mailbox. No name, but he recognized her handwriting instantly. Inside was a single page. "I heard what you've been doing. Not from the news people talk. Quietly, kindly. You're rebuilding, Richard, not for show. For real, that matters." He smiled, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't love. But it was something better, acknowledgement. He folded the letter, placed it beside the first one. The two lay there like bookends of a life he'd finally started to understand. Outside, the snow thickened, soft and soundless. He made tea, watching steam rise like memory. Maybe this was what redemption looked like, not grand gestures or perfect endings, but the small, steady act of living honestly after losing everything. He turned off the lights, stood by the window, and watched the city disappear beneath the snow. Somewhere, in that quiet, he thought he heard the ocean. Or maybe it was just the sound of peace arriving late, but finally real. And for the first time in a long time, he whispered, not to anyone, not for anyone, just to the empty room. Thank you. Outside, the wind carried the sound away, gentle and forgiving, and in that stillness, a faint, fragile hope began to grow. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old books. A small lamp sat on the corner table, its warm light spilling over the edges of the couch where Evelyn and Richard sat, two people who used to share everything, now divided by a cushion and years of silence. Outside, the rain tapped gently against the window, a soft rhythm that filled the pauses neither dared to speak into. Maggie sat across from them, mid-50s, hair in a loose bun, glasses sliding down her nose. She didn't smile much, but her eyes carried something steadier than warmth, something like truth. Let's start simple, she said. Why are you both here? Richard shifted first, fingers tracing the seam of his pants. Because I don't want to lose what's left. His voice was quiet, almost rehearsed, but cracked at the edges. Evelyn didn't move. You already did, she said softly. Maggie didn't flinch. Good. Honesty is the beginning. Let's keep it there. For a long moment, the room held only the sound of the rain. Evelyn looked down at her hands. I became small so he could feel big, she said finally. Every decision, every dinner, every silence, I folded myself to fit into his world. And one day, I realized I had disappeared. Richard closed his eyes, as if the words were physical blows. I didn't know you felt that way. You didn't ask, she said. Maggie's pen scratched across her notepad. And you, Richard. He swallowed, staring at the carpet. I built walls and called it strength. He looked up at Evelyn. I thought protecting myself was the same as protecting us. But I was wrong. The therapist nodded, slow and steady. Walls keep pain out, she said, but they also keep love out. Silence again. Evelyn's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. I kept hoping you'd notice, she said. Every year, I said less. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, maybe you'd hear me. He looked at her then, really looked, and now, she said, I'm learning how to speak again. A pause, a breath, the sound of the clock ticking softly in the corner. Maggie leaned forward slightly. Do you still love him? Evelyn. The question hung in the air, fragile and heavy at once. Evelyn didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted toward the window, following the streak of rain down the glass. I don't know what that word means anymore, she said, but I care enough to sit here. That has to mean something. Richard nodded faintly. It does. Love, Maggie said, isn't the absence of pain. It's the courage to face it together. The words landed softly, but they stayed. Richard repeated them under his breath, as if testing their weight. The courage to face it together. Maggie smiled for the first time. Exactly. The session went on, quiet but cutting. She asked them to recall moments, not grand gestures, but small ones. When did you last feel safe with each other? Evelyn thought of a morning long ago, when Richard had burned breakfast trying to surprise her. The eggs were terrible, but his laughter had filled the kitchen like sunlight. She hadn't heard that sound in years. Richard remembered a night they'd danced in the living room, barefoot, with no music playing, just the hum of the city through the open windows. She had rested her head on his shoulder. For a brief second, he'd believed forever was possible. They didn't speak those memories aloud, but they both felt them, lingering like ghosts. Maggie watched the silence between them stretch and soften. "Pain doesn't mean it's over," she said quietly. "Sometimes it means you finally stop pretending it was perfect." Richard nodded slowly. "I used to think success would make me worthy of love. And now," Maggie asked. "Now," he said, voice low, "I'm trying to be worthy of forgiveness." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes tired but less guarded. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you meet halfway." He didn't answer, but his hands unclenched. A soft breeze moved through the open window, carrying the smell of rain-soaked earth. It mixed with the faint lavender, grounding the moment in something real. When the session ended, they didn't rush to leave. Maggie stood, gathering her notes. "You're both doing the hardest part," she said. "You're showing up." Evelyn nodded. "It doesn't feel like enough." "It never does," Maggie replied. "Until one day. It is." Outside. The rain had stopped. The city glistened, streetlights reflecting on the wet pavement like scattered stars. They walked to the parking lot in silence. The air was cool, clean. Evelyn stopped near her car, hands in her coat pockets. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. Richard gave a small smile. "I almost didn't. But I figured, if I could face a boardroom full of enemies, I could face the one person who deserved the truth." She looked at him, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "You really think of me as an enemy?" He shook his head. "No. You're the mirror I spent too long avoiding." She studied him for a moment. His eyes looked different now, not softer, but clearer, like someone who had finally stopped hiding. "Maybe that's what healing looks like," she said. "Two people finally seeing the same reflection." He nodded, hands tucked into his pockets. "Maybe." For a while, they just stood there, listening to the distant hum of traffic, the sound of water dripping from the roof. Evelyn glanced up at the sky. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing a thin sliver of light. "It's strange," she said quietly. "I used to think love meant never falling apart." Richard looked at her, the faintest warmth in his voice. "And now, she said, "I think it means learning how to rebuild together or alone." The words hung there, soft but strong. She opened her car door, then paused. "Same time next week." He smiled, a small, fragile thing. "I'll be here." She nodded and got in, the headlights cutting through the damp night. As her car disappeared down the street, he stood there a moment longer, breathing in the air that smelled of rain and second chances. And somewhere, deep beneath the ache and the history, a quiet truth settled in this was no longer about saving what had been lost. It was about learning to live honestly, gently with what remained. He turned his face toward the clearing sky, whispering Maggie's words once more, letting them sink into the silence. Love isn't the absence of pain. It's the courage to face it together. And for the first time, he finally understood what that meant. The morning air smelled like salt and pine. The road to Camden Bay curved gently along the coast, the sea flashing silver through the trees. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat, her hand resting on the open window, wind tugging at her hair. Beside her, Richard drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the narrow road ahead. 6 months had passed since Seattle, 6 months of letters, therapy, and long pauses that weren't as heavy as they once were. They didn't talk much during the drive, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that carried memory and peace in equal measure. When the first glimpse of the ocean appeared, Evelyn smiled faintly. "It hasn't changed," she said. Richard nodded. Maybe that's the point. Camden Bay greeted them like an old friend, small houses with white fences, fishermen unloading nets, the sound of gulls cutting through the wind. They found the little house on the hill just past the cliffs. Weathered paint, a crooked porch. It wasn't perfect, but it felt alive. Evelyn stood at the gate, looking at it for a long time. "It looks like it needs us," she murmured. Richard smiled. "Good. So do we." They bought it that afternoon. No fanfare, no contracts handled by assistants, just 2 signatures on a folded piece of paper. ink smudged by the wind. The first night, they slept on the floor, surrounded by boxes and half-assembled furniture. The house creaked with the sound of the sea below. Evelyn lay awake, listening. It felt different this time, not the silence of distance, but the quiet of beginning again. The next morning, they painted the living room together. The air smelled of salt and fresh paint. Richard rolled the walls with slow, careful strokes while Evelyn stood on a small ladder, brushing the corners. "Don't forget that spot," she said, pointing with her brush. He glanced up, grinning. "Yes, ma'am." Paint splattered onto her sleeve. She gasped, mock offended. "You did that on purpose." He raised his hands in surrender. "Accident, I swear." "Liar." Her laugh was small but real. He hadn't heard it in so long it caught him off guard. For a moment, he just watched her, the afternoon light catching the fine strands of her hair. He almost said something, but didn't. Some moments didn't need words. By noon, they were both covered in paint, the walls uneven but bright. Evelyn stepped back, hands on her hips. "It's not perfect," she said. "It's ours," Richard replied. They stood there, side by side, looking at the room. Later, they cooked together for the first time in years. The kitchen was small, but the window overlooked the sea. Evelyn chopped vegetables while Richard tried to follow her directions, fumbling with the pan. "You used to hate cooking," she teased. "I used to hate not being good at things," he said. "Now I'm learning to enjoy failing." She looked up at him, surprised, and then smiled. "That's progress." They ate by the window, the sound of waves filling the space between their sentences. It was quiet, but it wasn't lonely. In the evenings, they took long walks down the path leading to the cliffs. The sea wind was sharp, sometimes carrying rain. Richard would slip his hands into his jacket pockets, while Evelyn walked with her eyes on the horizon. They didn't always speak. Sometimes, healing was just the act of walking beside someone without needing to explain why you stayed. As weeks passed, life found its rhythm again. Richard started consulting for a nonprofit that supported small businesses. He sat in a modest office above a cafe, mentoring young founders, teaching them about integrity more than profit. People recognized him sometimes, whispered his name, but he didn't flinch anymore. He didn't hide. Evelyn, meanwhile, joined a local environmental project. She worked with townspeople to design a sustainable park along the coastline, a place for children to play, for families to rest, for life to breathe. Her sketches filled the dining table, pages fluttering in the sea breeze. One afternoon, Richard walked in and found her lost in her drawings. "You're in your world again," he said softly. She looked up. "I finally have one worth being in." He nodded. "I'm glad." Their days weren't perfect. Sometimes old habits surfaced a sharp word, a long silence, but they both caught themselves quicker now. They apologized sooner. They listened longer. On Sunday mornings, they visited the small market in town. The locals had grown used to seeing them, Richard carrying bags of produce, Evelyn chatting with the vendors. They became part of the slow rhythm of Camden Bay, the kind of life where people greeted each other by name, and the ocean was both backdrop and heartbeat. One evening, as the sun dipped low, they sat on the porch together, mugs of tea warming their hands. The horizon was painted in gold and rose, waves catching the last light of the day. Evelyn rested her head against the back of the chair. "Do you ever think about Seattle sometimes?" Richard said. "It feels like another lifetime." "It was," she said, "and this feels like the first one I've actually lived." She smiled faintly. "That's a good answer." A soft breeze moved through the grass. The sound of the waves below was steady, patient, eternal. He reached for her hand not as an apology, not as a promise, but as a quiet acknowledgement. She didn't pull away. Their fingers fit together easily, like something rediscovered, not new. They sat like that for a long time, watching the light fade. Later, when they went inside, The smell of paint still lingered in the air. The walls glowed warm under the lamplight, uneven, imperfect, human. He looked at her and said, "I never thought peace would look like this." She smiled. "That's because you used to think peace had to be earned. And now you just live it." He nodded, taking in the words as if tasting them for the first time. Outside, the tide rose and fell, endless and calm. The house creaked softly, settling into its place above the cliffs, no longer just shelter, but something truer, a beginning built on what was once broken. And as the night deepened, their laughter soft, shy, and real mingled with the sound of the sea, carrying the faint promise that this time they would stay. The gallery smelled faintly of cedar and fresh coffee. Soft piano music floated through the air, blending with the quiet murmur of people moving slowly from frame to frame. Outside, the evening rain tapped against the tall glass windows, blurring the reflections of the city lights. Inside, everything felt still sacred almost. Grace's exhibition was called Becoming Real. The title hung above the entrance in graceful, white letters, glowing under the warm lights. Each photo told a story of someone shedding their mask of what it meant to return to oneself after breaking. Evelyn stood just inside the doorway, her hand resting lightly on her belly. She was 8 months pregnant now, the soft roundness beneath her dress moving gently as the baby shifted. Richard stood beside her, quietly proud, quietly nervous. It had been 2 years since they'd left Seattle. 2 years since they'd learned that peace wasn't the same as perfection. The house by the cliffs was still theirs, the paint still uneven, the sea still roaring below. But tonight felt different. Tonight. Their story was hanging on these walls. Grace spotted them across the room. Her face lit up. "You made it," she said, pulling Evelyn into a hug that smelled of rain and vanilla. "Wouldn't miss it," Evelyn said, smiling. Grace turned to Richard. "You look softer," she teased gently. He laughed. "That's the kindest way anyone's ever told me I've aged." Grace smiled, but her eyes were knowing. "No, you look real." They walked together through the exhibition. The photos captured fragments of life, children playing in mud, an elderly couple dancing in their kitchen, a woman sitting alone on a park bench with sunlight on her face. But near the center of the room was a wall that stopped them both. 3 large frames. 3 moments frozen in time. The first photo, Evelyn, standing on the beach of Camden Bay. The same one Grace had taken years ago, the wind catching her hair, the sun catching her eyes. She was laughing, truly laughing. Richard remembered seeing that picture for the first time, how it had burned something inside him awake. The second, Evelyn and Richard, standing hand in hand by the window of their small house. She was visibly pregnant, her head tilted toward him, his hand resting over hers. The light behind them was soft, golden. It looked like forgiveness. The third, Evelyn holding their newborn daughter, wrapped in a cream blanket, her hair messy, eyes tired but glowing. She wasn't posing. She was simply being. Richard stared at them for a long time. The world around him blurred, the voices, the music, even the faint click of someone's heels against the wooden floor. All he could see was her, the woman who had once disappeared into silence and now stood here, whole. He felt her hand slip into his. It was warm, familiar. She looked up at the photos and whispered, "That's what truth looks like." Her voice was soft, but it carried more weight than any speech, any vow. He turned toward her. "It's beautiful," he said. She smiled. "It's real." For a moment, neither spoke. There was no need. The photos said everything words never could. Grace came up behind them quietly. "I didn't tell you I'd be showing all 3, she said. Evelyn turned to her, eyes glistening. "You didn't have to. They belong together." Grace nodded. "You've come full circle. Ev," that first photo she was finding herself. The second, she was finding her peace. The third, that's life finding you. Evelyn laughed softly. You make it sound poetic. It is, Grace said simply. A small group gathered near them, admiring the photos. Someone whispered, that woman looks happy. Evelyn heard it, and her chest tightened not from pride, but gratitude. Because happiness, she realized, wasn't a permanent thing. It was moments like these, small, fleeting, honest. Richard reached for her hand again. You still scare me sometimes, he said quietly. She turned to him, eyebrows raised. Why? Because you keep changing, he said, and somehow I keep falling in love with every version of you. Her breath caught. That's the point, isn't it? He smiled. I hope so. They lingered near the photographs for a while longer. Evelyn's fingers brushed the edge of the third frame, her daughter's face frozen in pure, unguarded innocence. She'll never know who we used to be, she said softly. Richard nodded. Maybe that's the best gift we could give her. Later that night, as the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, they stepped out into the rain. The city glistened. The smell of wet pavement mixed with the faint scent of coffee drifting from a nearby cafe. Evelyn tilted her face upward, letting the rain touch her skin. It's the same rain, she murmured, just softer now. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Because you're softer now. She laughed. Don't get poetic on me. Too late. They walked in silence for a while, puddles reflecting the glow of the streetlights. Every few steps, she leaned into him, and he matched her pace without thinking. It was easy, natural. When they reached the car, Evelyn paused before getting in. Through the window, she could still see the gallery's sign glowing faintly across the street. Becoming real. She turned to Richard. Do you ever think we could have made it if we hadn't fallen apart first? He looked at her, rain dripping from his hair, his voice steady. No. Because then we wouldn't have known what real was. She smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. That's the truth, isn't it? He nodded. That's the truth. Back at home, their daughter slept soundly, her tiny breath steady in the crib near the window. The sound of the sea rolled in through the open curtains. Evelyn walked over and tucked the blanket closer around her baby. Richard stood in the doorway, watching them both. In the dim light, she turned, meeting his gaze. We used to build empires, she whispered. Now we build mornings. He stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. And nights like this? She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. The tide crashed gently in the distance. Outside, the moonlight shimmered over the water. Inside, their home glowed with quiet warmth, laughter, memory, and the sound of new life breathing softly between them. And on the gallery wall, miles away, the three photographs waited, silent and eternal, holding the truth of who they had been, and who they had finally become. The sky was a watercolor of gold and rose, melting slowly into the sea. The air was soft, filled with the scent of salt and pine, and the rhythmic hush of waves brushing against the sand. Evening had come gently, like a promise kept. Evelyn sat on a weathered blanket near the shoreline, her bare feet half buried in the cool sand. Richard sat beside her, quiet, his hand resting over hers. Their daughter was a few yards away, laughing as she built small towers of sand, each one collapsing before she could finish. And each time she laughed harder. They watched her, both smiling, saying nothing. Behind them, the cliffs glowed with the last light of day. The small house they had built stood in the distance, white walls, blue shutters, and a porch where the scent of coffee lingered long after sunrise. The tide crept closer, gentle and insistent, tracing new lines in the sand before pulling back again. It had a way of erasing what was no longer needed. Evelyn leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. Do you remember, she said softly, how quiet it used to be between us? Richard turned his head toward her. I do. She smiled faintly. Now it's still quiet, but it feels different. Because it's peace, he said. Because it's real, she corrected. He nodded, letting the silence settle again, this time full instead of hollow. A gull cried somewhere above, circling once before vanishing into the fading light. Their daughter clapped her hands, proud of a new sandcastle, tiny and leaning, but alive. Evelyn called out, "It's beautiful, sweetheart." The little girl beamed. "It's not done yet," she said, her voice carrying over the sound of the waves. Evelyn looked at Richard, her eyes soft. "Neither are we." He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "No, we're not." For a long while, they just watched the sea. The waves kept their rhythm, the world breathing with them. Every crash against the shore was a heartbeat, steady and ancient. Richard picked up a small seashell from beside him, holding it up to the light. Its surface was cracked, edges worn smooth by time. "It's strange," he murmured. "The broken ones always seem more beautiful." Evelyn brushed her thumb over his hand. "Maybe that's because they've survived the ocean." He turned the shell over once more, then placed it gently in her palm. "So did we." The light dimmed to amber. The sea turned silver blue. Their daughter toddled closer, sand clinging to her legs, holding up a crooked handful of shells. "For you," she said proudly. Evelyn bent down, taking them as if they were treasures. "Thank you, my love." Richard lifted the little girl into his lap. She giggled, playing with the buttons on his shirt. He kissed the top of her head, his eyes glinting with something quiet and deep, a gratitude too big for words. Evelyn watched them, the wind lifting her hair. Once, she had thought love was about holding on. Now she understood it was about standing beside someone as they learned how to change. The sun slipped lower, the horizon glowing like fire fading into memory. Richard spoke, almost to himself. "We lost everything we thought mattered, only to find what truly did." His voice was steady, but soft, the kind of truth that didn't need to be spoken twice. Evelyn reached out, brushing her fingers against his arm. "You were never really lost," she said. "You were just looking in the wrong direction." He smiled, eyes on the horizon. "You showed me where to look." The sea breeze shifted, carrying the sound of waves like a lullaby. Their daughter yawned, curling into Evelyn's lap, her tiny hands still clutching shells. They stayed like that as the sky deepened to violet. The first star appeared, faint and flickering. For a while, no one spoke. The world had gone quiet in the best way, full of breath and warmth and memory. Evelyn traced small circles on her daughter's back. Richard watched the water, the tide's slow return and retreat. Every rise, every fall, it all felt familiar now. It all felt right. He looked at her and said softly, "Do you think the ocean remembers?" She thought for a moment. Maybe. Or maybe it forgives. The wind brushed against them, cool and gentle, like an answer. He reached for her hand again, their fingers interlacing easily. They sat that way, side by side, as if time itself had decided to slow down for them. The girl stirred, mumbling something in her sleep, and Evelyn smiled. "She dreams like you," she whispered, loud, restless. He laughed quietly, the sound blending with the hum of the sea. "Maybe that's how you know she's alive." "Alive," Evelyn echoed, tasting the word. It felt right in her mouth, simple, unpolished, whole. She leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the salt, the dusk, the warmth of a love that had survived itself. The world around them dimmed to a deep blue, somewhere far out. A buoy light blinked, steady and patient. And as the last rays of sunlight dissolved into the water, Evelyn spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Real love isn't about keeping perfect things," she said. "It's about rebuilding what's been broken together." Richard nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The words lingered between them, soft as the tide. The ocean kept moving eternal, forgiving, knowing. And when the night finally fell, the sound of the waves filled the air, folding over the house, the cliffs, the family sitting quietly in the sand. No grand ending, no applause, just the sea, whispering its timeless rhythm. They stayed until the stars multiplied, until their daughters stirred and reached sleepily for their hands. One in each. Evelyn squeezed once, Richard squeezed back, and in that simple touch, gentle, human. True, their story found its peace. Fade out. The ocean knows. In the end. The Billionaire Ignored His Wife is not a story about wealth or loss. It's a quiet reflection on what it means to love, to forgive, and to begin again. It reminds us that real love isn't built on perfection or pride, but on the courage to face what is broken and choose to rebuild, hand in hand. Time changes people, and even the strongest hearts can drift apart when silence grows louder than affection. But healing, like the tide, always returns when we dare to be honest with ourselves and with those we love. For those in later seasons of life, this story whispers a gentle truth. It is never too late to soften, to apologize, to listen more than we speak, to find beauty in imperfection and meaning in the ordinary days we still have. Happiness is not a destination. It's the quiet peace of being seen, accepted, and loved for who we truly are. And like the ocean, love has a way of forgiving. Again and again, until all that remains is truth. Thank you so much for staying with us through this heartfelt story. If this journey touched you or reminded you of something real in your own life, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating stories that speak to the heart, heal through words, and remind us that love in all its forms is worth believing in. See you in the next story.